350 years of Jewish life in America. So let me ask you this. From your personal experience, your family experience, and also your professional experience as studying this, in terms of minority experience, what's more important, the hyphen or the American at the other side of the hyphen? Jewish American, Arab American, African American. What's more important, the hyphen or the American, and has that changed over time?
Well, I think that to answer your question directly, I've, over the years, become fonder of an approach that's been taken by one of the great rabbis of the 20th century, Stephen Wise, who refused to speak about himself as being a Jewish American or an American Jew, but he used to constantly refer to himself as, in this fashion, I am an American and I am a Jew. And having read and studied, and in my own personal experience, I sort of resonate with this, because for all different experiences, I think there's a kernel of truth to this. We are all Americans, and that is an identity in and of itself. And yet, we also have other parts to our beings. And the hyphenation, I think, puts the emphasis, on something that I think leads us awry, arguing about whether one part of it is modifying the other, and that means one part of the hyphen, a side of the hyphen, is more important than the other. So I'm sort of quite fond of the idea of we are lots of things, and we are Americans, and I'm a Jew. Others of us have.
Well, let's ask the other folks on the panel. Is that your perception of, I hate to say your particular group, but I guess that's sort of what this is about. As you were growing up, as you moved to this country, depending on your perspective, was it become, quote unquote, an American and put aside what you were, or have this sort of dual self-image? How did that work for everybody?
Well, having come here as a young child to this country, I really resonate with your comments in the sense that whether I'm talking about being an American or whether I'm talking about being a Muslim, it's part of the whole me. And to hyphenate it or to put one before the other, to me, doesn't represent the whole me. It's really, if in my being an American, I need to be the best and the fullest of what it is to be an American, and to be a Muslim should not, being an American should not limit me in any way whatsoever to be, the best Muslim that I can be as well. So, and at the same time, we're talking about faith here, but many of us bring various ethnicities in terms of cultures and heritages and history, and whether we're from a particular part of the world. I happen to have been born in Pakistan, so the language, the culture, the food, so that is a part of what my ancestry and my heritage is also about.
Let me ask you this before we get to some of the other responses. In this post-9/11 reality, do you think that many Americans, most Americans, do not realize that not all Arabs are Muslims, not all Muslims are Arabs, and if they don't realize that, does that make any difference, or is it just, that's ignorant, so what?
Well, no, I think it does make a difference, because if you look at the statistics, only 18% of the world Muslim population of 1.2, 1.3 billion are of Arab or Arab descent. That means 82% are from somewhere else. And so a lot of the things that we associate with a particular culture or a particular history or even politics may not apply to, a large majority of the population. So I think we get a skewed perspective in terms of where people are coming from if we make assumptions such as that, which are very inaccurate, and lead us to maybe perhaps act and react in ways which would be most inappropriate.
Mr. Peraza, when we were talking before we went on the air, you were saying that when you came to the United States as a teenager, and probably ever since your career, all through your career, you felt you had to be better than other people. Is that a function of the minority experience for you? When I say better, I assume you mean harder working, more successful.
Well, I felt that I had to work a bit harder than the average Joe Jones that works in college with me or in work. It was something I think is self-imposed upon me. It's nobody ever told me that, but I always felt that way. Let me make a comment on Shakila. I became a citizen in 1969, became a citizen. At that time, I did not have a blood transfusion when I became a citizen. I kept my old blood and became a citizen. So I brought my own from the past into this country. So hopefully I'm the product of two different cultures. I bring the best, hopefully, from my Cuban experience. I've acquired the best, hopefully, of the American experience. So I feel very, very fortunate of bringing two cultures into me and into my family.
Mr. Wang, obviously originally from Taiwan, but the same question in terms of your perception of the minority, sort of where's the hyphen go for you? Or maybe it doesn't.
My parents are Chinese from mainland China, and I was born in Taiwan, which is culturally Chinese, and I lived in Malaysia when I was 4. My parents took me to Malaysia, and Malaysia is a wonderful country of great diversity where the Muslims and the Chinese, Buddhists, Confucians, and the Christians and very few Jewish people, they all live in relative harmony. It's my experience as a teenager. And I went to high school there, in high school, a secondary school called Victoria Institution. And Malaysia at that time was just recently independent from Great Britain, and we still studied the King's English. And after that, I came to Delaware when I was 16 to high school in the United States. And then I came to Cincinnati.
A predominantly American high school, right?
Correct.
Was there ever a sense of you were a quote-unquote foreigner? Did you feel like you were treated differently, or was it simply you were in the crowd and that was it?
Well, I went to a boarding school. My father had wisdom putting me in a boarding school by myself. And as a teenager, I felt it was different, but the rest of the school was, maybe I was curiosity, but I didn't feel quite like it that way. And it was actually a good experience for me. And after that, I came to work here in Cincinnati and got my law degree here. And actually, I'm going back to my roots. I'm practicing immigration law, and that's the law of migration. And speaking of, if there's going to be a common bond in this human story, is the story of migration. The Hebrew tradition has the Exodus, it's a great migratory story. And the Muslims have the Hijrah, the movement from Mecca to Medina. And the Christians, and I am Chinese, but I'm Episcopal Christian. The Christians have the story of the Jesus family, Joseph taking Mary to Egypt, also a form of Exodus. So if there's anything common in the human story, is the desire to move from a place of oppression or danger to a place of safety. And this is truly also the American story.
Well, let me interject, though. There's always the yeah, but. And I guess, Ms. Nelson, you represent the yeah, but, okay?
Well,
and I don't mean it quite that way, but I mean everybody's ancestors at this table, if you go back far enough, or themselves, came here by choice.
Yes, they came by choice.
And so there's a huge difference, and that has got to be something that makes things different. And we say, quote unquote, the immigrant experience, or the minority experience, but overlaying the African American minority experience is the whole sense of not being brought here voluntarily.
I think with our experience, it's a matter of forced immigration, which is a very different notion than a person who leaves a safe place striving for something better in another place. Forced immigration is a very different story. And what we see with the African American experience is 300 years of enslavement, 300 years of forced labor. And in a sense, one can say that it is the African American experience, but because at the time that Africans were brought to America, this was an unsettled land. And so the story of forced immigration is wrapped into the story of the American experience. So it's very difficult for Americans who are of African descent to separate their forced immigration experience from the larger story of the building of this country, because it was the labor of the African people that built the economy upon which the nation grew. So it's a very different kind of an immigration story.
But are there commonalities through everything, or is it simply the old 800-pound gorilla that is just going to stomp on everybody and go, yep, it's just so different that even though there are some similarities, there are just so many more differences than similarities.
Well, I don't think that it's a black and white, cut and dry hammer that should be slammed down amongst all the other groups. I think there are commonalities. We do know that there were immigrants who came to the United States who were also part of a labor pool. When you look at the Chinese experience, for instance, that was a very restrictive experience. And when you look at what the United Nations defines as forced labor, and you look at some of the conditions under which other immigrants have worked under here, well, there are commonalities in the presence of Chinese people, for instance, and their work with factories, their work with out in California with building railroads, with the experience of attempting to become, yet having your livelihood restricted, and even your family's restricted.
Let me ask everybody this, because this is a group that represents, quote unquote, some minorities, and then you could have minorities within minorities. I mean, you could have gay, you could have other groups, so this is not everybody. How much of the minority sense is imposed on us, quote unquote, by ourselves, and how many is it, well, I'm this versus you're this, and does that make any difference? This is for everybody.
Well, I think there was a time when African Americans felt the need to be the representation of the group. And there was a time when access was so limited that there was a thrust by many families to push forward a generation of young people who would be the overachievers, who would be the ones who would break down the barriers. And many people were groomed into families that encouraged and inspired that. Since the civil rights movement, many African Americans are finding that that's just not realistic in a global community. That in a global community, we are looking at the human family. And what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to experience being alive in America, in Europe, in Africa, in Southeast Asia? And we're finding also that many people are crossing barriers that historically they were not able to cross. And we find that African Americans are practicing many religions that are creating engagements with other cultures. The barriers that were in place during a period of segregation, that restricted movement, that restricted your lives, those barriers, many of them have been broken, and the experience and in the engagement in a global community has primacy in the lives of many people. There is still the struggle that continues for equality. There is still the struggle that continues for access, but I don't think individually the majority of African Americans that I know, and that's a very broad base, I don't think they carry the weight of rah-rahing the flag of what it means to be African American. They want to be human.
What I have found in my case that when I came here, I came as a student, and I went to college, and I had a very easy life. I mean, but then you have, on the other case, you have other Hispanics who came in different educational levels, different work levels, who then have problems. So I have had no personal experience against me of discrimination that I know of, but I know a year and a half ago, a Hispanic kid was killed in Cincinnati. Nobody knows who was killed. Another young guy was killed in an automobile accident crossing a street at night. So you have almost socioeconomic levels that dictate where you come from and what you experience. And then you have perhaps two different levels of people, ones who are okay and ones who are not because of where they came from and where they're at. So it's going to take a long time to move from having nothing something to a higher level.
So how much of this is class versus whatever, ethnicity, race? Is it simply if you come to the United States with a good education and two educated parents, you fit in easier as opposed to if you just get off the boat or now get off the plane and don't speak the language? I mean, is it more a function of class than it is of race, ethnicity, whatever?
Well, I think that economics is a very important part of the whole story of immigration, and I think it has been from the beginning, and it has a different flavor depending on immigrant groups. My own thinking is that one thing that we share in common in terms of the nation in which we live is the attitude toward immigration, and this is an idea that is somewhat always evolving. When you can't really challenge the idea that America is a nation of immigrants. And yet, having said that, the character of the immigrants are very different. We have Native Americans who are not represented around this table, but they wouldn't, maybe they are, okay, Naomi, but not necessarily.
Ancestry.
All right, okay, well then that adds to the colors of the rainbow. But they are not necessarily a part of that immigrant experience, but yet because of the many people who've come here from so many different places and under different circumstances, often relating to economics and so forth, either in the old world or in the new world, there is a mosaic, if you will, or a rainbow. That's part of the essence of who we are. And the question is it something we want to preserve as a nation, or is it something we want to make recede into the background? That is, a melting pot where we all, even if there are still certain facial characteristics or body characteristics that might be somewhat different, that we really all let all of that go. And I think that myself personally, and I'd like to hope the nation, that we advocate for the preservation of the varieties and the different backgrounds that we all bring, and that we celebrate those, because that truly, Jeff, I really believe that's what makes our nation distinct and unique from so many other places in the world, combined, of course, with the nature of the government in which we live.
Well, I agree with you completely that the diversity that is apparent in this country is what makes it distinctive and significantly different from most other countries. But also, I really feel strongly that once American people, African Americans in particular, once we see that our struggle for freedom has not been distinctively different than the struggle for freedom of people in many other parts of the world, that we share commonalities with the world that we may not realize day to day. And struggle for freedom in the United States is no different from the struggle for freedom of women in the Middle East who are trying to gain some sense of access and some sense of freedom out of bondage, out of trafficking. When you look at children being sold by the millions in other parts of the world, is that any different from African Americans who were sold in the 19th century? The more we look for our commonalities outside of the color of our skin, the more we will find that we have commonalities with the world in our world experience, in our history, and even in our culture. I was in a village in Cote d'Ivoire in Africa studying the pottery of African women in Wasso. My daughter was stationed there with OIC International. And as I was watching these women shape these pots from the clay from the riverbed, they couldn't take the clay from the riverbed. Only the men could carry the clay, and only the women could shape the clay. And in this village, what I found was that the shaping of the clay for these pots was the substance of the economic framework for their village. And when you look at women who work with pots in other countries around the world, in South America, the experience of doing that kind of work, of participating in that kind of creative activity, is not very different in Africa than it is in South America, than it is even in Japan, where you still have some traditional making that is followed very strictly by the past. So the commonalities, I guess what I'm saying is, the commonalities bind us, and at the same time, our distinctive traditions define us. And it's those definitions in America that makes American culture rich and vital.
You know, we said we would take phone calls and email questions. That's 513-651-4800, or email questions at cetconnect.org. We've got a question.
Questions at
I can't get this right. Questions. I should write this down. It's right in front of me. Questions. Thank you. Questions at cetconnect.org. Some of us aren't quite into the internet yet. But we did get a question. And it's sort of a personal question from a viewer. And it's sort of, you look across, you look around, and basically this question is, how do you see each other? Not necessarily as individuals, or maybe it is as individuals. How do you see each other as getting either a fair shake or a not fair shake in an electoral system, educational system, or are we all, well, we all did okay? And I'm just relaying the question. And let's go over here because you haven't had a chance to go.
Well, I think, the one thing that we recognize is the fact that there are issues that minorities have had to deal with and continue to deal with, and some of it in terms of the issues may be larger in terms of educational opportunity and economic opportunity based on socioeconomic class and where we land and what we have access to. A lot of it is the inherent discrimination that may be in the society in which we're trying to assimilate ourselves into, and the opportunities not being available as a result of, outright discrimination. So, to answer your question, I think if we want to truly be a part of the larger humankind, as Naomi put it, I think we can't be blind to the fact that other minorities have had disadvantages or may continue to have disadvantages that we need to be sensitive to if we ever expect people to understand where we are coming from.
Now, you came to the United States, and how old were you?
I was 9 years old.
Okay, so is that an age where you're conscious of moving a whole cultural move, or are you young enough to just pick it up like a sponge?
I think there was quite a bit of an adjustment, even though I went to, English schools, and, my father had obtained his higher degree from the States before, and, we had some connections, as it turns out, in Cincinnati, where we ended up getting settled. But it was a rough ride, and a lot of it was just little nuances in terms of the dress and the terminology, and just the English that that was spoken versus Americanese versus British English. And so I think there was definitely a big adjustment period, and I think I was very blessed and very fortunate in the sense of having opportunities that maybe many other immigrants did not have, having the education, having a family support structure, having even some sense of community, even though it was very small, a handful of Muslim families in greater Cincinnati, and even a smaller number from that part of the world.
How important is it to drive up 75 to you and to see, when you get into Westchester, a structural representation of the presence of the Muslim community? Because I'm sure that has the same meaning, I'm guessing now, as the Plum Street Temple meant to the Jewish community 100 and some odd years ago. How much of it a sense is that, hey, we're here?
Well, I think it's a very strong sense of both letting people know that we're here, but also letting people know that we're here, come and get to know us. I think so much of the discrimination that I know Muslims face, particularly these days, is really not ignorance, as a friend put it, but really lack of knowledge, lack of accurate information. And so, it is an open door. It's an opportunity for people to get to know a group of people that otherwise they may not have any opportunity to get accurate information on. So it's a two-way. It's yes, we're here. The community has grown from the handful of families from when I moved to Cincinnati to, over 1,000 families that are part of that particular community, but then also families that want to have a relationship with the greater community in which they want.
Unfortunately, every minority group is stuck with stereotypes, okay? Mr. Wong, I mean, is this something that, when you came to the United States, your parents consciously made the choice, okay, here, you come to the United States, and they could have sent you anywhere. Is this something that you felt you had to deal with, or your friends had to deal with, or maybe even now? I mean, you're successful, you've been in the United States for a long time, but is this something that ever bubbles up and hurts, even in the most unexpected way, or is it never happens?
Thank you, Jeff, for mentioning a stereotype. The Asians is very often considered the invisible or the silent sector or minority. And in the sense that, we are that, we're a minority of minorities, and the Asian culture, if there is such a common thing as Asian culture, is towards respect for authority and for parents and for government. So we don't protest, or we don't take to the streets, or we don't complain that much. We're just here sometimes. And that's the common understanding of the Asian presence. As far as the Asian population here, we are small, but we are here. And going back to some of your observations, and we're really pushing, and first of all, I'm glad we're having this dialogue. Everybody has a point of view, and the public is calling in, and we can discuss these. As far as the Asians, we are a very broad group of people. There's no such Chinese or Taiwanese or Koreans. We're all here, so. And there's a common thread. The Chinese were in California, as you're pointing out, economics aspects. When the Chinese came to the West, the railroads and the gold mines, first the gold mines and then the railroads, and there was a shortage of labor, really. And a particular kind of labor back in the 1800s, when people were going to California, the wild and woolly West, there was no towns or camps, mining camps, and people dreaded to bring their women folk out. So there was a labor shortage of what women in those days did, not now. We have 100 years difference. But back then, because of the labor shortage, there was a shortage of people to cook and also to do wash clothes. And the Chinese had a bad experience of not being welcome into the gold fields. So they got here, they had to do something. So they cooked. The Chinese immigrants did the cooking and the washing. And from there came the Chinese restaurants and the Chinese laundry. The Chinese laundry has disappeared because of washing machines, but the Chinese restaurants are everywhere now. Right. And that's how I read, that's how the economic aspects took root here, is the Chinese fill a niche in the labor market. And there's validity to that. So, every story has this, every community has their story, and that's my little.
Have you personally experienced anything that even, I'm not saying you were turned down for a job or something, but even just hear somebody say something, maybe they didn't mean it in a mean way, but has it ever just made you feel, gee, this
sure. I'll just tell you a war story. I'm a lawyer. I sometimes try cases, and I had judges, a judge long time ago say, I cannot understand your English, That happens, and but maybe I didn't make a precise, accurate legal argument per se. So, but you have to deal with it and get over it. And I'm very proud of my English abilities and speaking English. And so, yeah, it's out there.
We've got a question from Don in White Oak, and he says he's curious. Do you think the attention to discrimination, how you want to define it, is it almost overdone? Is it too much? Is it distract us from trying to bring people together by focusing on the individual instances of wrongdoing or ill will?
I think that it's almost inevitable that it's connected to the minority and especially the immigrant experience. And it can never, in a sense, be ignored because, speaking about, let's say, the Chinese experience, the very first immigration laws, the restriction laws, are as a result of the Chinese workers. That provokes a reaction. And one could argue it might have it resonates with economic realities, and it has other issues probably as well social and so forth. But that factor, that is, that people come, they're different, and they impact upon the society, and that society then reacts in a certain way. It brings about a certain kind of behavior in a people. That's a tension, a dynamic that goes on in this country. I don't see how we can ever not focus on that. Especially the process of trying to settle in the country, because this is the tension I think we all feel. I think we all would like to preserve our heritage, and yet we all want to be a part of the American whole. That's a tension. How to remain who we are as Americans, how to remain true to our specific minority heritage, whether it's religious, religio-cultural, ethnic and racial, whatever. And that tension is going to produce certain kinds of discriminatory behavior, because differences must remain in order to preserve the past. Just different enough to preserve the past.
If you take that tension that's built around differences and you couple that tension with legal sanction, as in during the period of segregation and Jim Crow, where discrimination was legally sanctioned by the government. On March 18th, we'll be celebrating Thurgood Marshall's Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. And with the African American experience, we must remember that our struggle has been a struggle not only against society's norm and the tension around racial discrimination inherent in differences and history, but also government sanctions and laws that protected the norm that discriminated. And so the struggle of African Americans is a struggle for access
to work against those who are the terrorists.
I mean, Shakila, obviously it has to be harder to be a Muslim on 9/12 than 9/10.
Well, absolutely. It's a very challenging word for all of us, I think. I know Roberto and his wife and, feel wholeheartedly for the loss of a child. Nobody can imagine. And the thing that it leads back to the previous question as well is that, why should we care about discrimination against somebody else? Well, because sometimes if that discrimination goes unchecked, then you're alienating people who could be your best allies in whatever it is that you're struggling with, or whatever the population as a whole, the community as a whole that we live in. So when there were 1,700 cases of hate, bias, abuse, even violence and deaths against Muslims, Arab Americans, or people who look to be one of those two, just in the 6 months after 9/11, you were alienating Americans who were your neighbors, who are your allies, who empathize, who grieved, who suffered as a result of the atrocities. And, we need as partners in the passion that we have to have a safer world for all of us. So it really doesn't serve anyone's interest to let discrimination go unchecked.
How does that get out, though? I mean, here we are, we're all educated and middle-class folks, and we all think the proper thoughts here, and we all, love each other. But how do you get that out there to maybe people who are, I hate to deal in stereotypes, but just not as educated or not as open-minded?
Well, one way that we're trying to do that is by partnering with the Holocaust Museum and Education Center here in Cincinnati, and we've just put on view an exhibition called Facing Prejudice. And part of what we're trying to do is take an exhibition that Dr. Raysel Wyman curated that deals with intolerance and the various kinds of discriminations and injustices that people encounter and participate in every day. And we're using it as a tool to try to teach a broad general public about how do you become sensitive to this, how do you not participate in this, and how do you begin to change your own attitudes and inspire others to change their attitudes as well, so that we can all work towards a more harmonious environment. But also, when you think of all of us at this table from many walks of life, from many faiths, from many ethnicities, from many different cultures and countries in terms of our ancestral origins, when we look at the Freedom Center, we are in the process of using our exhibitions, using technologies to tell the stories of individual people who made a moral decision to make a difference and who stepped out in the midst of great threats, like a Mr. Withers, whom the Hebrew Union has been exploring the story of an African-American regiment in Germany during World War II. They went against the rules. They hid Holocaust survivors when their captains told them that you will be discharged dishonorably, you would lose all of your pay, your pension, you would be court-martialed, threats, yet they made a moral decision to help assist these Holocaust victims and held them in their heart. When they returned home, Mr. Withers kept the photo of these victims, and they were reunited as an older man in his 80s. Here he's reunited with people that he never forgot, yet he risked all to help them. So one of the ways that we can make a difference is by sharing these stories, by creating opportunities for people to come together, by being the convener where dialogues like this can be held at the Freedom Center.
Let me ask this, because there's the national perspective and then there's the local perspective. When we talked about 9/11, the question was asked locally, but it's obviously a national question. But what about quote-unquote minority relations, minority situation, minority status in Cincinnati? And I'm always going to get us back to the riots and the post-riots, but is Cincinnati any different than somewhere else?
Let me just carrying on your line of thought, and I'm glad you're getting input on this whole issue. Is there is no one? You've shown me the limitation of any one paradigm. I tried the religious paradigm, and it's limited, and the political paradigm, that's also limited, and even the constitutional paradigm. The Supreme Court has on many occasions failed. Dred Scott was a failure, for instance. Justice Taney could not do the right thing. That's why there was the Civil War, the baptism by iron and fire, steel and fire. So what I realized is really, whether it's local or national, is every single perspective or model of reasoning has a limitation. And what really is we put all the different models, and hopefully we'll have an answer, whether the local or national level. That's the beauty, the aha that I just got out of just sitting here and listening to everybody, and also from the inquiries, the questions. There is no single one paradigm that solves that adequately deals with this issue, but you need a multidisciplinary approach, and even in the local level. So.
Right, absolutely, and I think you cannot be afraid to challenge difficult situations or to confront and deal. And I commend, the NCCJ for initiating Muslim-Jewish dialogues. The dialogues in a day and age where the tensions have been the highest in the 30-plus years. I would say that I've lived, in the greater Cincinnati area, and then the country and the global dynamics are such. But if you don't address those situations, you don't bring people to the table that are willing to have those conversations and then expand those to a larger group in order to reach facets of your community that otherwise would never be engaged. The other aspect is education. I mean, we're blessed to have the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center here. At the same time, institutions such as like the Islamic Center have had 50,000 visitors that have come from the greater Cincinnati area in order to learn and to share. And so it's an opportunity for everyone to learn from every experience where you interact with somebody who's different than you at whatever level, whether it's a personal dialogue or an educational session. It's an opportunity for both of you to learn. And so the more we can provide of that, the better it is that, you know, a better place it is that we can move to for the society that we live in as a whole.
And here Cincinnati, in a certain sense, is very, very well endowed, because to have some of the centers that we have in a city our size is truly remarkable. The Freedom Center, this beautiful Islamic center, and the point that Shakila was making, that it's not just that it's there for the Islamic community, but the Islamic community is there for the greater community, for people to come and see. The Hebrew Union College with the Holocaust and Humanities Center, with the American Jewish Archives, the largest single collection of documents on the history of American Jewry and so forth. That's one important thing that we have that can benefit us. The other is the American way. And anyone who goes into that place will see it. That's the same thing with the Freedom Center. The Freedom Center's exhibit is not just about the Underground Railway. Its message is a message for humanity.
Got a minute left. Let's move around real quick.
Well, and you know, we're all minorities within minorities within minorities, which end up making us the great whole. And so, you know, the great whole of America is the beauty of what each one of us brings to the table. And so, you know, whether you want to use that term or not, but it's the diversity, the richness of what we all bring that makes us so unique and so strong.
Mr. Prado?
I got to follow up with what Gary said. I think the issue of saying I'm an American, I'm a Hispanic, that resonates with me very much too.
Ms. Nelson?
And of course, diversity is everything in my school.
Okay, my definition of minority is the African, the European, the Jewish peoples all cross the Atlantic Ocean. The Asians cross the Pacific Ocean, and we are the minority in that respect. How many other people cross the Pacific to get to America but the Asian?
And of course, we have to realize that there are other minorities not represented here today. That's very important, whether you could be a